Let's call it right now. New Zealand's housing market is a hot mess. Rents and house prices have grown faster than incomes for 30 years. That's the reason the rich are getting richer and the poor are struggling harder. It's also why our economy is choking. For housing to become more affordable, incomes need to rise faster than house prices and rents. So how will TOP do that? First, our tax system rewards investment in housing more than any other country in the world. TOP will tax housing the same as all other assets. Second, in the past decade we've had the highest immigration in the world. We couldn't build houses and infrastructure fast enough. Immigration must be managed. Third, we'll encourage quality, affordable apartments and terrace housing in our cities and support community providers who build affordable rental housing. In the meantime, renters will need stronger rights so they can turn their house into a home. Housing is the #1 issue facing a huge number of Kiwis. TOP says shelter must be a basic human right, not a get-rich-quick scheme.
Kia ora inga mana, ko hui mai nei ki tēnei whare, ki te kōrero i ngā whakaro ka nui te aroha. Welcome, folks, to this talk about ideas and about houses. And we have with us tonight the two walls of our housing policy. I'm trying to think of an analogy here, making it up on the spot. On one side we've got the pillars, yeah, pillars of it. Yeah, you're the architect, Brendon. I'm just going to give up. Our two pillars of our housing policy. We've got on the supply side the writer of our urban development policy, architect Brendon Monk, and our Te Atatu candidate. Kia ora, Brendon.
Kia ora.
So that's one pillar. On the other side, we've got, on the demand side, we've got our tax and UBI spokesperson, as well as our small business spokesperson, our candidate for Nelson, Mathew Pottinger.
Kia ora koutou.
So those two pillars, upon that sits the roof of our housing policy, and it really is, the strength of our housing policy really is brought into sharp relief by seeing all of the other opposition, the other political parties releasing their housing policies. National Party today, of course, and Brendon, big focus from them on freeing up land in order to solve the supply problems. So they want to do what they did in Christchurch, pass emergency powers, get councils freeing up land. What's likely to happen if National gets in this election?
Well, in the very big picture, we can, throw all attempts at dealing with climate change and sustainability right down the toilet for a start, because the real big picture on that is that we can't just keep sprawling. We really do have to just build more densely in our cities. And because the big thing around that is reducing carbon emissions. And we know, and we've known for 30 or 40 years or longer, some climate scientists have known for a lot longer, that we have to live in denser cities if we're really to have a chance in this. So yeah, they've got their heads firmly in the sand. Yeah.
And they continue to whack local authorities over the head, blaming them for the lack of progress, but are still unwilling to give them any money to build the infrastructure needed.
Yeah. Councils will do, if they're put in that position, they will do what National are telling them, because they won't have much option. We can't build well up when we don't have the infrastructure for it within our current urban boundaries. It's just impossible. So that's why there's serious infrastructure funding needed. And if they're not prepared to do that, then they're basically cutting local government off at their knees and saying, fend for yourself. And that's just not good enough.
So the other parties are at least trying on the supply side, albeit with some pretty massive problems in what they're proposing. But Mathew, on the demand side, they're not even trying at all. No one is talking about the tax break on housing, and in fact, a lot of the ideas that are coming out of other parties are actually going to stoke demand by giving more support to first home buyers.
Yeah, it's all over the show there. Like, I think it's probably even worth us going through each party and sort of outlining what they're planning to do with the tax system and how that, in effect, will push up house prices, because it'll do nothing except, increase the differential between the taxes that we're paying on other investments and the taxes we're paying on property. Whether it's the Green Party who want to put 2 extra tax brackets up over 120,000, 180, or thereabouts. So you've got that first, and that's bringing up those bars, and then you're whacking on a wealth tax on top of that. It's just doing nothing to fix that distortion. And then you've got Labor, of course, which we've sort of covered a fair bit, where last time we had this top tax bracket of 39%, house prices rose 17%. We've been here before. This is not one of those situations where we sort of got our fingers crossed and we don't know what might happen. We've been here, we've seen it. We shouldn't expect anything different. And yeah, the other parties, just as they've got the same lack of imagination in this area. One thing you were mentioning there about her first home buyer subsidies. So there was a debate in Nelson last night that I wasn't a part of, but I took part in the audience, and both the National candidate and the Labor candidate were discussing at length, almost debating who was providing more first home buyer subsidies. Now, this was their answer to the housing crisis. The thing about first home buyer subsidies is that no matter what shape or form they take, whether it's increasing the threshold that your first home buyer grant applies to. So here in Nelson, the caps are 500,000 and 550. There was talk last night from Nick Smith that they need to be increased. And all this does is it just pours fuel on the fire. It doesn't make our houses any more, it doesn't make them any more affordable. It just makes our severely unaffordable houses easier to buy, which is not what we're trying to achieve here.
Essentially what it is because our property market in New Zealand is as close you can get to a pyramid scheme without actually being illegal. What it's actually doing is it's making it a bit easier for those who are desperate to get into the pyramid scheme to actually get into it, which fuels it more from the bottom. There's always going to be those who, and they then stay hurt for a long time in it. There's still going to be a huge amount of people who never get into it, but are still paying into it because they're renting. And so that's how it really is, as Matt said, pouring petrol on the fire, really. And it doesn't fighting fire with petrol, as I used to say. Yeah.
And it doesn't build more houses necessarily. That's the other thing, in a lot of cases, if a first-home buyer is using it to buy an existing house, we are literally not solving any problem here.
Any other political party, policies that have come out recently that you guys want to cover?
Well, we could talk about some. There are some good things that Labor has done in the last 6 to 8 months, I suppose, around urban development, and that we would do it a little bit differently, but at least it's a move in the right direction. So, they did set up a ministerial portfolio for urban development, which is a good start. They have released a national policy statement recently, which is a national policy statement urban development, which is giving direction to councils to build more density into the cities. And there is some effort to try and fund some of the infrastructure needed for that. Again, we have a much better idea on how to do that it gives local government the funding through their own development, and so which is really good. So you end up with infrastructure funding, allowing more development generating more GST, which allows more funding, and so on. So the whole system works in lockstep.
I see Active pinched that policy too, Brendan.
Yes, they have. Or they've pinched half of it, because they are wanting to allow councils to rebate half the GST.
Yeah.
So just so they can be a wee bit different to us, I suppose. But imitation. What is it? Imitation's the
serious form of flattery.
Yeah. And what else have Labor done? I mean, they introduced they put an urban development bill through the end of last year, which was gazetted not long ago. Well, was it at the end of the year? Earlier this year, which gave Kaingaora power to operate outside the RMA, essentially, and to use a planning process that is almost identical to the one that we had already written into our urban development policy. But it's a good idea. But that process should be available to all developers, not just Kaingaora. But there are some good moves there. But in terms of, despite the national policy statement, the official line really from Labor is that they want to build up and out. National Party just want to build out. Just go for it. It just ruins some more,
productive land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is the irony, right? I mean, the National Party is supposed to be the party of farmers, and they're chewing up our best agricultural land. Well, under the last national government, they chewed up more of our best agricultural land than at any other time in New Zealand's history.
Well, since I forget the actual dates now, but I think since something like 2003, something like that, we have lost 30% of our productive farming land.
Wow.
Now, if National think that's a good idea, I mean, it's not just the loss of the land, but they're actually making it harder and harder for people to farm. They're making it expensive to farm, because all of the farmland and orchard land, all of our food producing land, most of the most productive stuff is near our cities, which is no coincidence. It's partly why the cities are where they are. Now, as we keep spreading across that, the farmland and orchard land that is about to be rezoned residential goes up in value. The rates go up. The rates go up an awful lot, and it actually becomes quite expensive to own the land, and it becomes quite hard to make the return you need by farming it. So people hold on for as long as they can, and then they sell. They get a nice big cash windfall selling it to be converted into more urban sprawl. But there are people who just wanted to farm and they can't. And then the next layer of farmland out from that becomes more expensive. And at the same time it's becoming more expensive, the ground is sometimes not quite as fertile. So they end up having to put more and more, nitrogen-based fertilizer on the ground to grow the stuff they need. And we know that's not good. So it's this vicious cycle of National in particular, but also Labor, actually hurting the farmers that they say are the backbone of our country.
And there also seems to be, on the demand side, talking about renters for a second, a fair bit of lack of policy in that area from the other parties. Would you agree, Geoff?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because we know it seems like, well, particularly National and Labor, I saw this through the debates I've had locally, there's this just full-on obsession that the solution to all our problems is for everyone suddenly to own their own home overnight, and forgetting for a moment about those who may not be in that position because they rent, and not even taking a moment to make renting better than it is. You know, we know it's going to take a fair bit of time to get house prices back to what would be deemed affordable. And so we can't just leave renters in the lurch. We need to actually improve the situation there.
It's something that's actually quite hard for many New Zealanders to get their head around, and understandably, because we don't know any different other than, you know, at some stage you will die and house prices will rise. That's, you know, the two certainties of life in New Zealand. And so if you don't own, you're screwed for life. And whereas in many other countries, if you've spent time living in countries where it is totally normal to rent and property values don't go up and all that sort of stuff, you know, coming back to New Zealand to this kind of mentality is quite strange. But if you've only...
Can I just jump in here, guys? Because one of
Sure.
the questions that's coming through on the live streams is why shouldn't it be a goal that everyone owns their own home?
Well, it can be. I think in a balanced system, Matt can jump in here in a minute, but, you know, in a balanced tax system and property system, it shouldn't matter either way. Whether you own or whether you rent, there should be no real financial benefit or any other kind of, you know, social benefit either way. And in some countries, it's not. I mean, I've lived in countries where you have the same rights whether you're renting or owning. Financially, it doesn't matter long term either way either. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, so like here's the nuance in this topic. It's about not having 100% home ownership as the driving goal. You know, if that's an outcome, fantastic. But if we're doing all of our policy creation based on that as being a goal, then we're just missing the wood for the trees. Because why are we doing it? Is there any evidence? There's only very weak evidence to show that high rates of home ownership is a good thing for a country, from like a society being, you know, behaving or, you know, being...
Well, there's absolutely no evidence at all, actually, Mathew.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, weak
there's good evidence in New Zealand that owning your own home makes a difference to your outcomes, but that's because there's such a big tax advantage that goes with it. In countries that have good rental rights, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever.
Yeah, and you know, and just to give people a bit of a picture here, the two cases are Romania and Switzerland. In Switzerland, home ownership rates are 38%, let's say, or thereabouts. And in Romania, home ownership rates are like 98%. And yet, when you look at where they sort of stick on, where they're located in the UN measure of functional societies, Switzerland comes out on top as opposed to Romania. Like there is no direct correlation there. So we, you know, it's completely misguided to have this goal of 100% home ownership, because what it does is we then create all these policies to effectively incentivize home ownership, whether it's through a tax break, which we're all very familiar with, whether it's through subsidies of all sorts of descriptions. I've mentioned before that the government was willing to give me a whole bunch of money if I just invested my money in a house rather than a business. You know, that's just an example of the sort of perverse outcomes that come from trying to reach that goal.
Yeah. Perhaps it's worth, you know, given some of the questions that are coming through, perhaps it is worth covering the current situation on tax and what we would do to resolve that, Matt.
Yep. So currently, you know, we changed our tax system back in the 1980s, and I always like to tell people the story Geoff told me once, where it was a Treasury. They wrote a report and they said, "Hey, look, we can't leave this hole in our tax system. We just can't leave it here, because if we do, then in 30 years, house prices are going to be out of control." But we did leave it there. We left it open. So we know that a capital gains tax is not the solution now. That would have been an option to plug the hole back in the 1980s. Now, because it's been open for so long, house prices have, risen, that we want to sort of fix it at its fundamental, at the core issue. A capital gains tax is merely mopping up the mess afterwards. We want to stop the mess from happening in the first place. So our property tax is just about taxing all assets equally. A good tax system, if you're doing a broad-based tax system like we do in New Zealand, we've decided that we should tax everything a small amount. And when you take that approach, you should ensure that you are indeed taxing everything the same amount. We don't tax property. So we are basically saying the equity, so the bit that you own in property, should pay at least the same amount of tax as a bank deposit. And we're saying that because it kind of makes a lot of sense. A bank deposit is really it's a very low risk investment. So you would hope that any investment you had would be returning at least that, if not more, because chances are it's more riskier. And that's how our property tax works. Functionally, it's about a 1% tax on the equity if that equity isn't actually currently returning anything. So if you've got a $1 million house and a $600,000 mortgage, which is pretty common, my mortgage is $500,000. This is just nuts. Then you're left with $400,000 worth of equity, and it will be a tax each year of 1% of that. So 4,000.
Nice. And, we don't want to increase the tax take overall, so we'll use that to reduce other taxes,
Yep.
making sure that most people are better off. So, yeah, great. So we can put up the tax working group graph so that people can see the current, state of the current system. So that this shows exactly what Mathew was talking about, how the tax on other forms of investment are actually amongst the highest in the world. Those really high bars are for businesses and KiwiSaver and shares, and those low bars you see on the far right hand side are for property.
So if we broaden the base, if we tax more things, we can tax everything less. This is not about more taxes by any stretch of the imagination. This is really just about evening stuff up, and then we're good to go.
So a couple of questions in here, Brendon, about rent freezes. One person seems to think that Top is advocating for rent freezes, and someone else is saying, why don't you do rent freezes? And
we do need some sort of rental control.
Yeah.
Compared to what we have now, absolutely. And there is more than one way of doing that, and it can be adjusted depending on for unique situations or times. But generally, all we really need is to be able to balance rental control to stop landlords hiking up rents, really out of whack with general rental in that area or throughout New Zealand. And the one way of doing it is just making sure that landlords can't hike rent up quicker than what the average is around, in that locality, or in that city or that town. Because there's nothing wrong with rent going up over time if it's just going up at a small pace, which it would do naturally if house prices aren't rising out of control. Rents aren't going to rise out of control either. So, and one thing we want to do, of course, is give equal rights to renters. So we do want to overhaul tenancy law. We want to make it so that anyone renting can basically make that house their home. If they are paying the rent, if they're looking after it, there is no reason on earth why they should be able to just be booted out. that is just not fair. And we don't want to make it so that landlords can just start hiking the rent up higher and higher so that they can't pay it and then get kicked out. So as long as we can control that rent by saying, okay, you can raise the rent maybe once a year, once every couple of years, a little bit, but you can't just hike it right up out of whack with everything else around. No, that would sort a lot of the problems.
And it's probably worth pointing out here too, from the landlord side. Well, right now the average tenancy length in New Zealand is 1.5 years, and that just doesn't make good tenants, because why would you care for the place that you live in? Why would you bother getting to know the community around you when you're moving every 1.5 years on average? So by having this sort of more mature housing market where if you're a renter, you can stay longer term, then you're as a landlord more likely to get better tenants who are more likely to look after the place, because there's a sort of a sense of home that they're getting from that. And as well, landlords will often say it can be difficult to get rid of tenants who aren't paying the rent or damaging the property. That, the model that we're bringing to New Zealand, the German model of security of tenure, it does allow landlords to evict a tenant if they are doing those things. But if you're not, if you're treating the place and you're paying your rent, then society in New Zealand is going to be way better off, because we know the research on what makes good citizens. I've seen a lot of data that says, right, if you're living in the same place for a long period of time, it builds strong communities, strong connections, improved mental health, and all sorts of things. All the other established parties, political parties, will use that evidence to suggest, right, everybody needs to own their own home. But they forget the point that, well, if we made renting better, if we provided security of tenure, then we could get all those benefits. It doesn't have to.
We've sort of got a situation in New Zealand where you have some people on the landlord side saying, oh, but there's such stink tenants in New Zealand, the law's all against us, we have these shitty tenants, we can't kick them out. And then from the other side saying, well, we got these mean, nasty landlords keep hiking rent up and blah, blah, blah. But it's the system that's causing the animosity on both sides, and one affects the other. It's hard to be a landlord because the house prices are so damn high that if you want to get into it, you got to have your rent so bloody high to cover the investment that your tenants struggle to pay it, and the tenants are not happy because they're paying such high rent to live in places that can be pretty awful. So it's sort of one thing affecting the other. So at some point we've got to deal with these things, and if we can hold the house prices steady, control rents a wee bit, give people that security of tenure, make it so that over time the landlords can actually get a better return off their investments because they don't have to put so much money in the first place, then everyone's happy. And then slowly we'll transition to a country where people renting can actually feel happier renting and feel a bit more, almost ownership, if you like, of the place they're living in. So like it is their home. They treat it better, they pay the rent, everyone's happy. We've just got a lot to learn and a long way to go.
Mathew, you were going to finish off?
Just a quick analogy here. Like if you went to a restaurant to eat, you would get a better service from a restaurant that's actually making a profit off the meal that's being served to you. You wouldn't, let's assume McDonald's doesn't make much profit at all. The service isn't great. And that's what we've got in New Zealand. We've got McDonald's, we've got fast food, because landlords are barely making any money on the service that they're providing, on the accommodation. Of course, they'll make money on the capital gains, but we want to get to a point where, renting's like a fine dining experience where your landlord is making a profit from the service they're providing, therefore they're incentivized to actually make it better, to actually put a heat pump in for you.
Yeah, we've got a McDonald's where there's some greedy cooks out the back that are hogging all the food to themselves in the corner. It's just the scraps that are getting sold.
Mathew, question here. Why don't we exempt the family home?
Very good. So I think this is like a very key point to top, because when you first sort of think to yourself, well, why are house prices crazy in New Zealand? You think about landlords, you think about people with more than one house, and you think that that's where the tax break is. But in our tax system, it's very clear that owner-occupied housing and the lack of tax on that is where the biggest difference is between the different taxes. So it's very important that we at least acknowledge that in the first case. The other thing is to say, well, actually 2 out of every 3 houses in New Zealand is a family home. It makes up the bulk of the housing market, and 75% of the total value of the housing market in New Zealand is family homes. So hopefully that gives a bit of a perspective on where we need to focus our energies. We need to make sure all property pays their fair share of tax, but just excluding that 75% of family homes, that's not a great place to start. You need to look at it all. And then we need to also understand that the difference between a family home and a family business, that's the way I like to look at it. Fundamentally, a house is providing a service of accommodation. One happens to have your name on the title, another one that's being rented out doesn't, but fundamentally they're the same commodity. And if we don't at least attempt to tax those in the same way, then we open up this huge hole and we don't even begin to solve the problem.
Nice.
Just coming back to tenancy law. I just wondering if there's any other things we should summarise from what we know should happen. I mean, one thing that should happen is a landlord should not be able to kick someone out just because they want to sell a house. Now, and a lot of people in New Zealand will think, that is crazy. It's your house. You should be able to do what you want. You own it, But the countries that have what we call mature tenancy law know that that is very disruptive to society. So if someone wants to be a landlord, fine. That property is a rental property. The person renting it, they are the ones who are making it a home. If that property is sold, they should go with it. And so that's certainly part of our policy. And what else? There should be some control on or register of property managers and things like that. We need law that does properly look out for rights of people renting, so that we don't want situations that like we have at the moment where landlords are converting a 3-bedroom house into 5 or 6 bedrooms, and then converting the garage into a couple of bedrooms, and all this sort of nonsense that gets a lot of people living on the site, but in very poor conditions. This is basic stuff, but it's stuff that we don't have at the moment.
Mm. Another question is around what are the drivers of the mess that we're in at the moment, and I think we've covered a lot of them. I mean, we've talked about the tax system, we've talked about the restrictions on supply, we've talked about the problems with local authority funding. We haven't talked much about the cost of building supplies.
Yeah,
Brendon?
so I guess to put it simply to people, we say the mess we're in is because of 2 main areas that most people understand the words of, demand and supply. So on the demand side, we know that the tax system is distorting the demand, to heaven and back. We know that we've got bad tenancy law, which we've just talked about. There's also been some problems with immigration, and which we could probably come back to later if we've got time. But then on the supply side, we have had extremely restrictive planning law that has made it hard to actually build houses where we really need them, which is in our cities, as close to our city centres as possible. And that has caused sprawl, which is really bad. And one of the problems with that has been the infrastructure funding, and we talked about that just briefly at the start. So we need to have seriously good infrastructure funding to our regions, and we can come back to that if anyone wants any more detail on that. But then we've also got a completely broken building industry, and it's broken from one end to the other. On the material side, you just mentioned, Geoff, we do pay very high prices for materials in New Zealand. There's debate around how much more we're paying here compared to other countries, but you could conservatively say it's 30 or 40% more than Australia. But on many things, and I've checked them, I've checked a lot of different materials, we're paying sometimes 100% more. Now, that is because, again, there is debate around this, but we really do have a bit of a duopoly going on in the supply market here. I won't name names, but everyone knows who they are. One way of sorting that is in our policy is that if we could open up New Zealand's building standards, material standards and performance standards to overseas markets that we know are really good, like some European countries, some North American countries, and even some parts of Asia, then we could get those building standards into New Zealand, into our building code. That would mean that we can then import certain products that are very hard to bring in at the moment because they don't comply with the way our standards are written, and also a lot of building systems, and even in some cases, complete buildings, a lot easier into New Zealand. Now, yes, it's much better to buy Kiwi made and all that sort of stuff, but while prices are really high and we've got the restriction problems here, bringing those things in will, at the very least, bring some competition into the marketplace to help bring prices down and bring the standards up. So it's a bit of a win-win. We have also got problems on the supply of social and community housing in New Zealand. That's something that needs to get upscaled big time and done better. Again, the Labour Party at the moment has, in the last 6 months, has started to make some inroads there with the way Kaingaora is operating now, starting to build the sort of developments that we do need where we need them, not the sort of crap we don't need where we don't need anything, which is what Kiwi Build was. So there's a lot we can do there on the social housing side. And again, if anyone has got questions on that, we can go into detail on what we're planning to do there.
I guess the other big driver at the moment is monetary policy, and it's quite a recent phenomenon, but quantitative easing, the Reserve Bank's printing money in order to buy debt off the banks and keep interest rates at rock bottom levels, which and because of the tax system issues which Mathew's talked about, people are instead of leaving their money in the bank, losing money by keeping it in the bank effectively, people are piling into shares and particularly property. So that's another
source of fuel on the fire.
Another source of fuel on the fire. And some people think that this current set of low interest rates could push property prices up by 20 or 30%, which is pretty incredible. Mathew, question here: what's the difference between our tax policy and what the Greens are proposing? I know you've briefly set this out, but do you want to go into a bit more detail about that?
Yeah. So the Greens tax is a wealth tax. It's very much a wealth tax, and the tax applies to all forms of investment. You saw the chart before, but we've got here too. So the wealth tax increases the height of all these bars here. And therefore, it's not actually addressing, as we know, the differential between property, the way property is taxed, and the way other investments are taxed. It's doing absolutely nothing. What it does do is it brings the taxes on those other investments so high to the point that it's basically pummeled them to nothing in terms of the return you can get from them, that property ends up being, again, the best bet, because at least there's some breathing space there. TOPS tax is different. It's a minimum tax. So it doesn't actually, as long as the thing is being taxed at least that much, or you're paying at least that amount of tax, you don't have to pay any more. And this means that even if it did apply to everything else, it wouldn't increase the amount of tax that the other forms of investment would pay, because they're already paying that amount. But what it does do is focus very, very, very closely on the property, on the loophole in our income tax system around property. So our tax is not a wealth tax. I don't know how deep we want to go here, but I mean, I get a lot of feedback about that, because people will say, well, it's not fair to tax wealth. It's an envy tax, but we're not. What we're doing is we're taxing the economic benefit that is derived from, owning property. A classic case is owner-occupied property. And so it's therefore taxing your annual income. Now, it's not cash. That's the sort of key thing that people, it takes a bit of time to wrap your head around. So where all these other investments, you're generating a cash income. On owner-occupied property, it's non-cash. But that's the part that we're taxing. But all the details don't really matter. The point is, when it comes to that chart, we're very clearly bringing up the bars on property so that they are equal to the other bars, whereas Green's wealth tax are bringing all the bars up to the point where there is no longer any return that you can get from businesses, and the only place to then put your money is in property.
I mean, TOP are essentially making the tax system simpler and cleaner. The Green Party is, currently it's a complicated system. The Green Party are making it more complicated. And a question, Matt, we were talking before about how hard it is to be a landlord. It's hard being a tenant, and it's also hard being a landlord. If a landlord is currently getting a bit of a return on a house they're renting, under Green policy, are they going to get slammed with another tax?
Yeah.
Oh, Geoff's silent.
I think we've lost you, Geoff.
Sorry. I muted myself to cough just before I forgot to unmute myself. Good chats though. There's a couple of questions about monetary reform, and absolutely yes, I think we need to review monetary policy so that the Reserve Bank stops flooding the market with cheap money. But guys, there's a really good question here from Adrian, and I just want to finish with this, and it might take you a few minutes to answer it. But basically what Adrian's saying is, given the mess that we are in, given the hole that we have dug ourselves in terms of housing, like what actually is what does the best case scenario look like for restoring affordability? So can you paint, what he's trying to say is that what his question is, I mean, he can't even see even best case scenario that the next 20 years is going to look very positive. But that's his question or his statement, I guess. But what are your guys' views on if Top got 50% in the election and we could actually impose all of our policies? Even then, it is still going to take time to fix the situation. But what does it look like for the next 10, 20, 30 years going forward? I'll leave you guys a couple of minutes each to talk about that.
I'll start her off. So instead of incomes rising faster than house prices and rents, which they've done for the last 30 years. It doesn't matter how many times I say that, it still seems so ridiculous that every year your rent goes up more than your income did. So instead of that, what we're doing by allowing the market to actually respond to the demand, and we're stabilizing house prices, effectively sort of holding them flat, because house prices should only be rising when our incomes do. So each and every year from here on in, if we implemented all our things to fix the housing market, you would see that your income would rise, but your rents wouldn't. And so each and every year, your rent in real terms is getting cheaper. And this is really just about your incomes rising faster than rents and house prices. Now, partly by fixing the tax system, we've sort of opened up investment in business again. You know, we've fixed the incentives in our tax system that mean that all of a sudden, when you've got $100,000, it's not just so obvious to put it in property anymore. There will be more investment in business. Now, this investment in business can take the form of R&D, research and development, which can lead to better products being sold for more, meaning that you get paid more for making those products. It's all this sort of stuff where, you know, this is about productivity, and in New Zealand, it's relatively low compared to OECD countries, and we've been sort of falling away from Australia over the last few years. So it's about fixing that, increasing our productivity, seeing our incomes increase at a faster rate, and house prices being stable, such that, you know, we've modeled that 12 years, we can get back to a point where instead of being median house price being 7 times median household income, we can get it back down to 5.1. And anything, once we get to 5.1, we're out of the severely unaffordable range. And that's a great start, because right now, if we don't do anything, we're just going in the other direction. And then give it another 10 years and we get down to 4 times median household income. And where we want to end up is 3, because our median house price to median household income ratio was 3 back in 1990. And overseas experience shows that 3 happens to be roundabout where everything settles when you've got a functioning housing market. And if you want to know how broken our housing market is, knowing that naturally it would sit around 3 and house prices would rise with incomes, to know that we're now at 7, we're above double what it should be, just goes to show that, you know, for 30 years, National and Labor haven't done a thing to fix this.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at it as, you know, we've had a whole lot of harm happening for 30 years. And if TOP got in tomorrow and a number of key policies got across the line, then what would happen is that harm stops. So although it might take 30 years to get to the place where we've got affordable housing and sustainable, warm housing and all that sort of stuff, and nicely functioning urban environments, at least from day one, there would be a sense of relief that the hurt has stopped. And that's a big thing. You might not be able to afford a house on day one, but at least you'll know that you're not falling further behind. And I think just the mental relief from that would be huge in New Zealand. And another thing is that, you know, after only a few years, I think that there would be noticeable differences. I think that there will be a lot more existing property that will actually be available on the market for rent or to own at better prices, you know, than what you can get now. So I think that, you know, there would be a noticeable difference after just a few years of TOP being in there. You know, problems with housing is linked to a lot of other social issues in New Zealand. And again, kind of going back to the renting thing we were talking about before, you know, a lot of people a lot of landlords or property managers might have the view that some renters in New Zealand have got a lot of problems, and social housing in New Zealand has got a bit of a stigma because a lot of people think, oh, it's a lot of bunch of ex-criminals and drug addicts and things like that. And there probably is a higher proportion of people like that in social housing, but partly it's housing has caused that. Poverty and inequality in New Zealand is really the gateway to a lot of other social problems, including drugs and crime and things like that. It's poverty. And so these people, you know, their families kind of get in these awful situations through stress of not being able to afford rent and things like that. And those things, all of these social issues would start to improve within, I'm sure, within a few years of actually of TOP being in there. There would be a real sense of better well-being, you know, in one term of TOP being in government. And
can you just give us a brief, you know, when you talk about better urban environments, Brendon, you know, can you give us some detail on how that might look for people in their day-to-day lives? Yeah, well, again, it's something that's it won't be transformed in 1 or 2 years, but over the term of TOP's vision, you know, looking ahead over the next 10, 20 and 30 years, what we're talking about is we know that we're going to have more people in New Zealand, not just from our own population growth. We know that we're going to have more people in here through probably a lot of climate refugees even. So we're going to have a lot more people. We know we want them to live in our cities because we have to if we're serious about climate change and sustainability. But we also know that we can accommodate more people in our cities in a really nice way. If we can build good, modern, warm, sustainable, mixed-use developments, which is a combination of, you know, there can be retail, offices, things like that, with apartments above, all that sort of stuff. And we're not talking about just filling a whole city up with apartments. You know, we're nothing like that. But what it will be is really nice mixed-use developments, some apartments, some terraced housing. There will still always be standalone houses, but people do really enjoy living around other people, even when they don't know it because they haven't done it. But we're talking about nice, higher density living in the city that will be close to public transport. We're not talking about a bus stop, but more light rail, because that is nice, clean, quiet transport that people actually like using. Buses are good, but they're not really good, like modern trams and light rail. So we're talking about that. And we're also talking about preserving more green space and more trees and having these as shared outdoor amenity areas, you know, shared parks, pocket parks, some bigger parks. And it's places like that where you actually meet people. Good cities around the world that have done this and done it even half well tend to have less social issues and social problems than sprawling cities. And it's to do with, well, the general term is social sustainability. Part of that is social connection. The more that people interact with each other, even just through seeing each other at a park or the pocket park or the shared outdoor area that the terrace houses have or something like that, the better off people are. The less we don't want, you know, we want to move to cities where not so many people are living alone in isolation or far away from family, far from hospitals or medical care, all that sort of stuff. But to do it, we just got to stop spreading out towns and pushing, you know, currently what we do, we push the poorest people further and further away from where they work. And that's not good. So we just want everyone living, you know, not closer together, but
within the space we've got, in the right kind of housings and developments where everyone has their private space, but you just don't have to go as far to get to everything you need. You can walk out the door, you can walk to the shops you need, you can, walk and hop on the train to get further around the city if you want. That's the sort of vision we've got for, 30 years from now. And it can start tomorrow.
It's probably worth pointing out here that just how serious we are about it it's easy to talk about what the vision is for the future, but people might be thinking, well, how do we get there? Where do we find the funds to do this sort of stuff? And we've got the New Zealand Super Fund, right, Geoff? The fact that we've made New Zealand superannuation affordable for the long term and not by having to raise the age of eligibility means that we free up $35 billion of
47.
47 now. Okay.
Well, it was 40 something last time I looked.
Yeah, I haven't looked for clearly years. But this is the shot in the arm that our infrastructure needs. This is how you get the sort of public transport dreams of the future. And we've got that plan. We're not just sort of making this stuff up. We're serious about it.
Yeah, I mean, we've got National and Labour fighting over who can promise the most, to buy votes. 20 billion here, 15 billion there, 30, whatever. Whereas without even trying with the policy we've got, we know we can give them that tomorrow if needed. But we've also got a plan to be able to fund infrastructure in New Zealand across the regions to the tune of 2.5 or 3 billion a year, just through our cunning little plan around the GST on developments. So that amount of money alone will be a huge boost to our cities and regions. So we've got all that covered. We know how to find the money to do all this stuff, and not put New Zealand in massive debt that, everyone's children and grandchildren will be paying off over that 30 years,
All right, team, we're going to have to call it an end there. We're coming up on time, but hey, thank you so much for your input, and that is a great vision of the future. One of the comments in the stream described tonight's live stream as brain porn, so well done. Thanks for making the subject so accessible. And thanks for all your mahi, Brendon Monk, our Urban Development Spokesperson and candidate for Te Atatu, and Mathew Pottinger, our Tax and UBI Spokesperson and candidate for Nelson. So we're going to leave you with our campaign video, and we will see you again soon. I think Shai and I will be hosting the minor party leaders debate this Thursday, which will be a great opportunity for us again to talk over our fellow politicians. Kia ora.
October 17th is the day you get to decide what you want for Aotearoa New Zealand. 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years in the future.
TOP has a plan to tackle the biggest issues in our society. We're a team of experts, not politicians. We're scientists, economists, lawyers, small business owners.
We'd bring in a universal basic income, $250 a week for every adult Kiwi, no questions asked. This gets rid of the welfare trap and allows people to retrain, start new businesses, and rewards unpaid labour like household work and volunteering.
TOP's housing and tax reforms would hold house prices and rents stable for a generation. New Zealand needs property owners to pay their fair share of tax. We need more quality, medium density housing around active and public transport networks. We also need stronger renters' rights so everyone can call their house a home.
Small businesses are the backbone of New Zealand's economy. To help them thrive, TOP will abolish provisional tax. We'll help businesses with digital uptake and energy efficiency and give them access to universities and polytechnics to solve their problems.
You know, the COVID recovery, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to build back better than we were before. We can improve the environment and have a thriving economy. This is what real progress looks like, and businesses can be part of the solution. Aotearoa New Zealand is a taonga, it's a treasure. Decades of old school thinking has given us the problems we face today. Let's make a change.
The Opportunities Party has the skills, ideas and courage to make real change. Don't leave change to chance. Party vote top.